Always trust.
We ask the question, what is needed in the world?
Reporterka i heroina Youmna El-Sayed izvještavala je za Al Jazeeru iz ratne Gaze, koju su međunarodne novinske organizacije od 7. oktobra prozvale najsmrtonosnijim mjestom za novinare ikada. Njoj i njenoj porodici krajem oktobra izraelska vojska prijetila je putem telefonskog poziva. Javljanja uživo vodila je uplošena i gladna. I kada bi izvještavala kao novinarka i kada bi se krila s porodicom nakon javljanja kao supruga i majka, sve vrijeme pokušavala je preživjeti, jer nijedno mjesto i niko nije siguran u Gazi. O izvještavanju tokom genocida u Gazi, o strahovima za dobrobit svoje djece i porodice, ali i o profesionalnosti, novinskom pozivu i potrebi da se svijetu obznane izraelski zločini nad Palestincima, za Al Jazeeru govori Youmna El-Sayed.
Youmna, welcome. It is a pleasure and honor to have you on Al Jazeera Balkans program.
Thank you so much. I'm very delighted to be here with you and to finally find myself in somewhere else surviving from this genocide in Gaza.
Glad to have you here. I'm sure you have been asked this question a lot, but what was it like to be a journalist in Gaza, reporting from the war zone that is at the same time your home?
Well, it's pretty difficult to be a journalist in a territory like the Gaza Strip, because in every single war, the mutual thing between all these wars is that the Gazan or a Palestinian journalist covering the war from the Gaza Strip is always a direct target to the Israeli army. They've always been persistent in making our duty and our job very difficult by direct targeting our offices, making us work in very difficult conditions with very little equipment. Something that other journalists in different areas covering wars or conflicts or even natural disasters wouldn't be facing. But this time, this war, the events were quickly unfolding in a very rapid manner, but also in a very terrifying manner. And we journalists found ourselves not just being targeted as journalists, but also our families being threatened, being targeted, being under attack, which gave us or had a very difficult emotional and physical inflict on us as Palestinian journalists. So basically wearing our press vests and our press helmets did not give us that sense of security that we are protected as journalists, labeled as journalists under international law, like other journalists in the world. No. Being labeled as a journalist in the Gaza Strip makes you a deliberate and direct target for the Israeli army.
Was this the point when you decided, actually, because you've seen this war will not be as any other war before you have seen in Gaza Strip, to evacuate? And how difficult was it for you to leave Gaza behind in such conditions and situations?
Well, I did not evacuate from the beginning of the war. I evacuated after 3 months of this war. But in these 3 months, I had been evacuated. I have been forcibly displaced with my family 5 times from Gaza City, where I originally reside, to the south, to Khan Yunis, and then back to Gaza City, and then to another area in Gaza City, which is the Sabra neighborhood. And then I went back to Khan Yunis, and then I went to Rafah.
And we're talking about complete families, small children.
Exactly. All these movements, all these forced displacements were not just me as Youmna, the journalist alone, but me with my family, with my children, with my husband, having to move from place to another in great amounts of fear, terror, and basically lacking all the basic necessities of life. We lived in circumstances and conditions that are unbearable for human beings, without enough food, without water, without drinking water, without bathing water, without any kind of electricity, internet, any kind of energy that we could find to make our lives a little bit easier, with the constant disruption of communications. So all these are circumstances that just got from worse to worse every single day. And we had to bear all that while working at the same time. What made me really decide to leave the Gaza Strip at the end was the constant threat that I felt that my family was in. So again, I was threatened in my home to leave my home with my family under very heavy bombardment in the neighborhood where we were. We were not able to come out from my home at that time. We were not able to leave our home because of the constant bombardment. And we told the Israeli officer that spoke to us that we can't leave because this is life-threatening to our children. 4 days later, the Israeli army had already entered the Gaza city and encircled our neighborhood. They were on a tower called Mushtaha Tower that is just 20 meters away from my building. And they started shooting at us. They started shooting sniper bullets at us on the windows of our building while we are at home without any prior warning. They shot the gate of the building, they tank shelled it, and then they started calling on their mics to give us 5 minutes to leave our home. We left the building with other families that were in the building. They started shooting at our car, and then we left to another area in Gaza City. Days later, we received pictures of our building completely leveled. So you can imagine the amount of terror and horror that my children had to live and go through until we were able to get out of that place and run, like literally escape for our lives. And then it did not end there. In Khan Yunis, the same thing happened. Then we had to go to Rafah. It's just ongoing like that.
Let's talk about a little bit of passiveness of your international colleagues, because it's been almost 9 months now that international journalists haven't entered Gaza. Of course, Israeli forces don't grant them access. There was an open letter in February this year. I think it was like 40 journalists demanding from Israel free access to Gaza so they can report about this. And access was, of course, not granted, and the silence kind of just resumed. What do you make of it?
Well, I've always been saying this since the very beginning, since I have come out of Gaza, that international journalists, they have unfortunately abandoned the right in entering the Gaza Strip. This is a fight that they needed to fight. They needed to take a very clear and strong action towards, like they would have done if it was any other government other than the Israeli government that took that decision and that prevented international journalists from entering the Gaza Strip. We've heard international journalists speak about the suppression of freedom of speech, by different other governments, but they did not talk about the suppression when it came to the Israeli government. Writing a letter and signing it once every couple of months, that's not going to grant you that right to enter as a journalist and to cover that war that you should be doing. This is your job as a journalist. I have not seen international journalism bodies come together and condemn this prevention. They have not, for example, denounced this prevention. They have not spoken about it every single day in their live shows. They have not even done any concrete actions or taken any concrete actions to pressure the governments to speak out to the Israeli government and to pressure the Israeli government to allow these international journalists How else are they going to be allowed to enter the Gaza Strip? And this is what made us as Palestinian journalists endure all that suffering and all that pain and all these tragedies that we have been going through for the past 7 months, going to 8 months now, and we're still under the same circumstances because the entire world depends on us. But we are very much disappointed by the stance of international journalists around the world.
Why is this so? Why there is this, let's call it, Israeli exception?
Because this is let's say, this is the exact definition of double standards that is being practiced by the international organizations or journalistic organizations in the Western world. And you cannot have double standards as a journalist. You need to be impartial. So instead of fighting for that right, we started hearing about, for example, there's a lack of information coming out from Gaza, or there are no Western journalists entering Gaza, and that's why we don't have enough information to report about what's happening. Or Palestinian journalists are affiliated to Hamas, or Palestinian journalists are biased to the Palestinian narrative.
Yet Western media took only Israeli narrative without even questioning it.
Exactly. All these are lame excuses, okay? Because this, in reality and factuality, has not been happening. Palestinian journalists are not affiliated with Hamas. There are independent Palestinian journalists, just like they are Palestinian journalists who could be affiliated with Hamas, just like there are Western journalists who are completely affiliated with Israel. You find this and you find that, but to choose that you only focus on the best thing that supports your stance or your idea for an excuse of you not doing the right thing that you should be doing as a journalist, as an international journalist, that is just a bunch of lame excuses.
One thing that was mentioned, and not even mentioned, but quite reported heavily, is the number of killed journalists in Gaza. The Committee for Protection of Journalists said it's over 100 of journalists in Gaza that have been killed. It's actually in 8 months, so it's the deadliest period ever for journalists. Just for comparison, in the Iraqi war, which lasted 8 years, something over 200 journalists were killed. With such rapid and unprecedented killings of Gaza journalists, did you expect more solidarity from that part and more outrage from international colleagues?
We definitely expected more solidarity, more support, more actions, real actions to be implemented. I mean, we're talking about 145 journalists, Palestinian journalists being killed. These are other than the journalists who their families were killed. So just 145 are Palestinian journalists who have been killed. And yet some committees, like the International Committee for Protecting Journalists, for example, just says that 100 journalists have been killed, or over 100 journalists have been killed. So not all journalists in the Gaza Strip are considered as journalists.
Do you think that the product of Israeli narrative, that there are no innocents in Gaza, that every civilian is a terrorist?
We know for sure, as Palestinians residing in the Gaza Strip, that every single Palestinian in the Gaza Strip is a legitimate target for the Israeli army, whether they were civilians, whether they were journalists, doctors, paramedics, defense teams. Everyone is a legitimate target. If Western journalists and international journalists were to enter the Gaza Strip from day one to cover, they would have understood and they would have seen for their own eyes what we have been reporting about for months. They would have seen that the Israeli narrative is not the one true narrative in this situation, and that our narrative as Palestinian journalists, independent journalists, we are as credible as any other international or Western journalist.
Israeli forces, just like the state of Israel, they kind of control the media narrative for months. Do you think that Israel now is losing the control over the narrative?
I think that Israel for a very long time has been ongoing with one narrative that has been completely untrue and completely unreal. And it has been supported, unfortunately, in its narrative by other international journalists and other international organizations that now, after all these months, are paying the price for their support of the Israeli narrative that has been going for a long time. So this is backfiring on them. They have seen, we have spoken about Israeli suppression of freedom of speech, and they have completely ignored that reality because it has come from Palestinian journalists. But now they themselves, as international journalists, are paying this price. They have been abandoned. They have been suppressed.
The journalistic profession.
Exactly. They have been suppressed.
But why was this so? Was it because they were blackmailed? They will be called anti-Semitic if they report, if they critique the Israeli government, the Israeli forces, what they're doing.
I think that Israel has used the anti-Semitism term as a weapon for so long, and it has used it in the wrong way, and it has been able to systematically impose it on every person who is trying to say no or is trying to condemn or denounce the Israeli actions that are illegal against the Palestinians, to be called anti-Semitic, which is completely unrealistic to the fact of being anti-Semitic. And that support that it has got from the international world and from the Western world specifically is now backfiring on them, because they themselves are now suffering of the same repercussions of using this term and this word. We can see that, for example, the protests that are happening in these Western countries now, the encampments in the universities, these are actually people from these Western communities. Now, they are forced to call their own people anti-Semitic, okay, although they know for real that what they are doing, what they are protesting against, does not mean that they are anti-Semitic. But because this has been an ongoing reality that Israel has imposed on these Western communities for a very long time, and they have called anyone who has spoken out against any illegal action by Israel as an anti-Semitic.
One area, one war zone, let's call it, that they could not control was social media. How important was social media for the war in Gaza?
Social media is a very important weapon because, again, the non-support, okay, that we did not get the enough support or the support that we needed from the journalists, the Western journalists, in covering this war on the Gaza Strip. And so these people like Mu'taz Azaiza, like Bisan Oda and Bilal Khalid and other Palestinian social media journalists, let's say, or content creators, these are the people who their message was to other people of the world, the civilians of the world, you know, the residents of the world. They're talking to other people, basically. The youth or the young generations that don't really watch a lot of TV, but rather use social media platforms to get their news, right? They have used the pictures and the footage. These pictures and this footage was already in use with the Western media and the international media. But they did not use it.
And they've been exposed to this content that they couldn't have seen on their TVs and on their media houses.
So it was a very good and very important, actually, stance by these content creators. Because again, in Palestine, in Gaza, every single civilian now with a phone who is able to speak even a very little bit of English found himself in that position where he has the duty, moral duty and ethical duty to show the world what is happening in his country, because no one else is willing to come and to fight for the right of showing the world what is happening in your country.
And when you see these mass protests, student protests, but also civic protests across the globe, in London, in Madrid, in Barcelona, in Milano, do you think this can bring a political change, that people will bring change, not the governments?
I've always believed that the people have the most power because they are the majority. Yes, the governments are in power, but they are the minority, and the majority always overcomes the minority. We needed the people to see, we needed the people to feel what is happening in the Gaza Strip. It took us 7 months for the people to look at Gaza, to realize the genocide that is ongoing in Gaza, and to start acting. It took us 7 months. It took us thousands of Palestinians to be killed and the destruction of 90% or over of the Gaza Strip. It took us a lot of suffering that we have endured, but at least this has not all gone in vain. We are seeing very positive stances, international stances. We are seeing support and solidarity among the people of the world. And this is what will bring the true change.
It took only a few days, to be honest, when the Ukrainian war started. So how do you comment on this?
Since the very beginning, we have always been mentioning this. We have been mentioning this when journalists were killed in Gaza. We have mentioned this when the war started. Every single thing that has happened in Ukraine and was acted upon very quickly and very rapidly, and the entire support of all these powerful countries and governments, and the non-support, completely non-support that we have witnessed towards the Palestinians when they are in war with Israel, and despite the enormous difference that is happening in the Gaza Strip, and the amount of killing and the amount of bombardments. And we have been calling out for this. We have said that the double standardcy of these Western governments in dealing with the Palestinian-Israeli issue and dealing with the Ukrainian-Russian war is completely different.
There is ICC's prosecutor's application for arrest warrants for Israeli and Hamas leaders, for Benjamin Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant, and 3 Hamas officials for war crimes. Would you call the ICC application, along with this, mass protest that we talked about, calling for liberation of Palestine, finally as the end of Israel's impunity?
I think that if it is implemented, it would be the end of Israel's impunity. But when you find that the first reaction by the U.S. embassy, by the U.S. administration towards this warrant or arrest warrant is that it's a very disgraceful or ridiculous stance taken by the court, you feel that they are not yet, they are far yet from doing the right thing towards the Palestinian issue. I mean, the Israeli, the U.S. government has been for years speaking about a two-state solution, but not for once has recognized or supported the Palestinian state.
But it's getting recognized by Norway, by Spain.
But the words are completely contradicting to the actions. You can't say, yes, we want a two-state solution, while you hear the Israeli government, prime minister after prime minister, bragging about how much they have succeeded in completely avoiding a two-state solution, and yet not doing anything about it. You can't say we want a two-state solution and not recognize a state over the other. Israel has been recognized as a state, but the Palestinian state has not been recognized. And the settler violence has been ongoing over and over every year. The lands have been confiscated over and over, and yet the entire world is just watching complicitly, because if you're not doing an action, also silence means that you are complicit in these actions. I mean, under international law, Ben Gvir and Smotrich are recognized as terrorists, but yet they are allowed to be one or two very strong ministers in the Israeli government that the entire world is dealing with, while Hamas is recognized as a terrorist organization, and no government in the world is willing to deal with Hamas. Why is the war, why is the law, international law, being implemented here and not implemented here? Why is it always double standards here? Why is it always selected?
So what do you expect, or at least hope, for Palestine?
I hope that the people around the world continue in their support, because they can bring the true change. We have lost hope in the governments because it has been ongoing for very long. And these government stances, the Western government stances, is not going to change unless the people, their own people, pressure them to change their stances. And that's why we have all our hopes very high on the people of the world. They are the ones who are capable, by their protests, by their pressure on their governments, to bring some peace to the Palestinian people and to the recognition of a Palestinian state with real Palestinian borders and real legitimate rights that the Palestinian people have been deprived of their entire lives.
Youmna, it was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.